Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and I'm also one of the directors of the New Economy Network Australia. And I work with Mary Graham as a director on Future Dreaming. And these are the three organisations, together with Anne's own organisations, that are hosting you today. But I'll give a proper introduction, and unlike the other speakers today, I might share a couple of slides just so, whoops, that's not the one. I always like to show my beautiful slide of my water lilies so that I can introduce things appropriately. I think my buttons are rebelling today. Okay, nearly there. Crikey. Ta-da! All right. So, given we all live on Zoom these days, and to make sure you're in the right place, welcome. And our discussion today is part of World Localisation Day, which is in fact something that Helena will talk in depth about, which I'm really excited about. But today's session is called Caring for Country and Caring for Each Other, a discussion about what localisation means in Australia. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm a non-Indigenous person, a descendant of the colonising folks who came here some time ago and are still here. I'd like to acknowledge that I live in Brisbane, which is the traditional lands of the Yuggera and Turrbal people. I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful civilisation and governance system that cared for this continent, and the peoples who continue to care for country today, the first peoples of the continent now known as Australia. I recognise elders past, present and emerging. And I also like to acknowledge the ongoing legacy of colonisation in this country and the obligation that we all have to play a part in decolonising and reconnecting ourselves to this continent. Wonderful speakers like Yin Paradis talk about re-indigenising ourselves, meaning those of us who are not originally from this place, making sure that we engage and love the continent that we live in. This photo is of my local waterhole. It's called the Nige Waterholes, or Nige Naha, which is the Turrbal words for black duck waterhole. And I recommend or invite you all to right now take a little moment and think about where you live, work and play, whose country you live on, your contribution to its place, and I guess contemplate for a moment the plants and the animals and the people that you love and care for. We all rush around from one Zoom meeting to another, and I think it's really lovely to just take a big deep breath and have a think about the things that are local to us, the things that give us passion and happiness. And yeah, I think it's a nice way to start a discussion about localisation. I would like to acknowledge also the four organisations who are bringing this lovely discussion to you today. I'm sure you all know about Local Futures, the Economics of Happiness, which is the initiative that Helena Norberg-Hodge has been leading for many, many years. And Helena will talk in her session about the Local Futures work, and also the wonderful international series of events that are making up Localisation Day this year. I also want to remind folks that the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is all about shifting industrialised societies from human-centred to earth-centred cultures. This is my baby. I've been working on Ayla and creating her work for many years now, and we're very, very happy to have auspiced many other networks and to support the work of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks across this continent, and to connect with our friends around the world. Future Dreaming Australia, if you've not heard of us, Mary Graham, myself, Ross Williams, and Lib Macon originally, and now James Lee, are the directors of this wonderful organisation. And we're working on a range of projects this year to build ecological knowledge across different ways of learning to help people reconnect with place and to really care for place, not just in our day-to-day actions as individuals or people in a household, but the institutional structures that need to shift all at every scale across all of our mainstream society. We need to do so much more to care for place and to care for each other. Last but not least, the New Economy Network Australia. This is a remarkable network of thousands and thousands of people, and it was created about 4.5 years ago by a group of us, and it's now got dozens and dozens of leaders across all sectors in Australia, working towards bringing people together, peer-to-peer learning, really co-creating a vision, a very practical vision for what our economic system should look like so that our society is fair, earth-centered, and sustainable. So without any further ado, what I'll do in a moment is I'll introduce Mary Graham, and then Anne Paulina and Helena and myself. We're all going to give about 15 minutes to talk about what is localization in our world, in our culture, in our work. And of course, it's quite wonderful to be able to share this discussion with people like Mary, Anne, and Helena, amazing women coming from such different perspectives, but with very similar visions for how we must care for each other and our places. So without sharing any more screens, oh, and just a reminder, please do stay on mute and pop any questions you have as you go along in the chat box. We'll have heaps of time for discussion at the end of the presentations. So if everyone could just pop your questions in as we go along, I'll collect them and handle them after I give my own talk about some of the things that I'm working on as well. But Mary Graham is a remarkable thinker. She's an adjunct associate professor at the University of Queensland with a focus on political science, philosophy, governance, many, many good things. I'll let Mary give her introduction to her own people, her own way. But I'm also very privileged to be working with Mary on a book about how we can rearrange our governance systems in Australia for the future. Over to you, my dear Mary. Oh, you're on mute, my dear.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm really pleased to be making a contribution with all these good people. It's wonderful. So could I start by trying to introduce myself in an Aboriginal way. So my name's Mary Graham. I was born in Brisbane, but I grew up in my father's people's area down here on the Gold Coast in southern Queensland. The Yugambeh speaking Kombumerri mob here on the Gold Coast. My mother was a Waka Waka person from the Burnett River district near Gayndah. She was under the Act, as they say in Queensland. If you were under the Act, Queensland Government Act, you were your life was controlled basically by the government. My father wasn't under the Act. He had to ask permission for her to marry and move, and so I've got a lot of relatives around here in this region. I usually start off with Aboriginal because I've got 15 minutes, and I'll go like mad. I'll try and talk fast. But yes, we sort of. I always start off with when the whole Earth, the lands, the continents were joined up. So the idea of Aboriginal people walking into the country was not. Was a kind of an idea, and I suppose many others were like this too, joined up, so they walked into each other's countries and so on. But for Aboriginal people, the people who became Aboriginal, that is, I do agree with the old out of Africa conventional idea. I know there's lots of different ideas about that, but essentially it starts off here in this country with the idea that the land is in relation to human beings. That is, that the land invented human beings. So that's the creator, really, but not in a worshipful, hierarchical kind of way. So our humanness arose from the earth itself, gradually spreading out around different places, but it's so old that when Aboriginal people hear discussions about the number of millennia, tens of thousands of years we're talking about, they think that's all very terribly interesting. But what they actually say is, when you ask them, they'll say, no, we didn't come from anywhere else. We came only from this country. What they're saying is that their physical and reflective being was invented or created in this country. So the land actually literally invents us. The latest research actually says that our DNA is tied in with, in a sense, if you can say land has DNA, it's actually tied in. So we really were, strictly speaking, created in this country as human beings, you know. And of course, starting off in a relationalist way, the attributes of this relationalism are autonomy. So we're all autonomous groups or beings. Our clan groups are autonomous too. Where about everything, the political and social ordering is in balance. Balance is extremely important. Ethics, there's maybe not a word or words that strictly mean ethics, but there's a general word to do with the law, but of course it's in different language words right across the country. The law for how to behave in this country, you know, how to behave in your country too, and with other countries. And the other one, of course, is place. So place is very important. Land is the raw material. Land can also be territory. It can be property, real estate, and so on. But when it's been sacralized, when you have this sacralizing relationship with land, it becomes country. So all these different groups across the whole continent, you can see it on the Aboriginal language map. It's more than a language map. It's actually a system that you're looking at, a political, social ordering system. That's what we're looking at. So, and because it's a system, that's what makes it a civilization. It's a civilizational culture. So just to do with, say, place, there's the old idea, the French Descartes Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am. The Aboriginal equivalent of that is I am located, therefore I am. So all meaning comes from a place in a locality in land. And of course, everybody else's idea is that too. Balance is extremely important in all sorts of ways. It's a gendered balance, gendered governance balance, gendered governance, so balance between genders, men's law, women's law, men's business, women's business, men's spirituality, women's spirituality, and so on. Because you can't, you've to have a balanced governance system, you've got to have both running things, basically, not running things in a Western way, of course, and not democratic, because the individualism that is at the heart of democracy is simply not there. You are part of a group, but that's not to say that your individuality doesn't exist. It exists within the group. You find your individuality, or you are brought up in this group, and so you know your identity is extremely firm, solid. It's relational, like everything else is relational. So the view of looking at life itself is, first of all, it's between relationality, relationalism, and survivalism. So although we say that term, we have survived, you know, it's an old political term. And of course, we're great survivalists, you know, in the basic physicalist way, you know. But survivalism, it sort of works like this. Relationalism is everywhere. Survivalism is everywhere. Everybody experiences it. But to go further than that, in those both areas, a relationalist ethos means that you have that relationalism is the crux of all meaning. So the thing that teaches you about relationalism is land itself. So the idea is that, to put it in a really brief way, it's a sacralized ecological stewardship system, essentially, and that became and becomes and stays as the what do you call it? That's word. The copy, basically, the template for social and political ordering. So you're grown up with a sense of looking after something outside the self, not necessarily belief in a hierarchical spiritual system with a Godhead kind of character, but so every different group has a dreaming story or genesis, if you like. Just imagine it, hundreds of genesises across the whole country. Not one genesis for the whole country, not just one. And the clan group system, they're all autonomous with each other. So just imagine also a great big continent, all of them with local government system, a local government, no central government, no regional government, nothing like that at all, just all central and quite independent, but they're all connections between them, between all of these clan groups and so on. So it really is a multipolar country, actually, multipolarity in one country. And soon, lots of people, very good thinkers are looking at a multipolar world. Well, they couldn't do worse than look at Aboriginal systems of how to do that and get to run a whole country, but not only a whole country, but a whole world in this multipolar way. We have our own logic too, that helps. And in a sense, this relationship, this local relationship with other locals, it gives rise to a kind of the logic that we have, so that all perspectives are valid and reasonable. I won't go through it, and it's very different to Western Aristotelian logic, and different again to Chinese paradoxical logic. It's the logic of locality, actually, localism. So you have to have a good relationship with each other. Basically, it's the suspension of judgmentalism. It's very useful to have that in a political and social organizational principle, ordering. So you can't get away from judgmentalism, but for purposes of good relations with each other, you simply have to have that, So there's so many different things that Aboriginal people worked out in the relational with each other, that it's strange that lots of people are looking at these things now of trying to have different systems. The one that encourages me is not only that more and more people are looking at how important it is to have this relational way of thinking with land, with the environment, and so on and so on, and to care about it and to actually work at caring about it, having a system like this. But that I've heard of people's assemblies, citizen assemblies, to replace, well, it probably won't replace entirely, but because democracy is seen to be extremely wanting, it hasn't really worked. It hasn't stopped wars when people didn't want wars, hasn't stopped that. So the idea of people's citizen assemblies, where power to the people, power of the people, becomes really, really the most important thing. And you don't have hierarchical, hegemonic, harsh, dominating rule by certain groups of people, just groups of people in a hierarchy over the people. You don't. So you have to have balance in that way too. So no hierarchies, no patriarchies, nothing like that, and more local. The flat system across the country just simply fits in with localism. And that's where real power comes back to people. So, for example, an example might be something like a suburb, a gathering of suburbs. They look after their land, that land, but not in an ownership sense, but in the law of obligation sense. So a law of obligation, a custodial ethic towards land. And just in your area, you can have it in an ideological sense, the whole country, the whole world, and so on, yes. But start with the local. So I might leave it there. Is that okay?
That was an amazing introduction. Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Yes, thanks so much, my dear. And we will come back. We already have a couple of questions for you, but we'll come back to them when we hear from our other speakers. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thanks.
And Anne, I'd like to introduce you now. I've known Anne Paulina for 5 or 6 years now, watching, and now lucky enough to work with her and her remarkable work across her own region, which she can tell you all about. But Anne is involved in so many discussions about the kinds of things we need to do in this country to care for each other. And her bioregional perspective from her own ancient culture is quite remarkable. So thank you so much, Mary. And now over to you, Anne.
Mababara, Naji Gurijan Nyambo Boroyaro Jogan, Ngayo Imadawara man, and Ngai Mandajara Nigan, and Ngai Nigan and Nganga, Ngai Nganga, Matawara Boro. So in my language, which is Nige Naha, I just said, good day, welcome to Jugan and Yaru country. I'm in Broome. Broome is my home, but my traditional lands is the Fitzroy River, the Matawara. So when I introduced myself, I said, Ngayo Imadawara man, and which means I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River, not in regards to property rights, but a law of obligation to protect that river, because we're not arguing for our river's right to live, we're arguing for our river's right to continue to live and flow, which is a little bit different. So yeah, my world, it's an amazing story. And you know, I have done a lot of things. My training was originally as a nurse, so I developed an ethics of care very, very early, because when we are born as Aboriginal people, particularly, you know, on our lands and across the continent, we are given what we call a jarinj, or a totem, which is a creature, a non-human being. So my totem is the blue-tongued lizard. So we learn that I have a lifelong relationship with a totem, which is for me, the blue-tongued lizard. And it's a really interesting thing, because it teaches us as human beings that we are all equal with nature, and that nature is our family. So when I talked about belonging to the Fitzroy River, that is a law of obligation, not a law of property right, whereby we learn to have and form a deep relationship with the river system. And this has happened for millennia. And so we introduce ourselves from that concept, because animals, non-human beings, can teach us how to be fully human and more human. So despite all the things I've done, like I said, I went into nursing and had a journey on there. I have 3 masters and a PhD, and I've just completed a second PhD. And people say, why do you bother to do that? And the more I know, the more I do not. And so my journey is about learning many, many things, because what we're dealing with in our world, whether it's local, whether it's regional, whether it's national, whether it's global, is that we learn that we are dealing with complexity. And when we're dealing with complexity, we need collective wisdom. We need multiple forms of science. Part of the work that I'm doing, you know, with Michelle and other legal scholars is looking at, and with Mary, looking at how do we bring first law into building a framework of legal pluralism, where this wisdom that Indigenous people hold, this ancient wisdom, starts to be seen as being valid and has meaning and merit in so many things. Mary mentioned that, you know, when we look across our nation, you know, we almost weep to know that we are bringing on economies that are going to leave our young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in $3 trillion debt. So the system's thinking at the very high peak of the chain in terms of governance and government and public policy, law, regulation, it's all failing. It's in chaos. And it's quickly spiraling out of control. And so what we're saying as Indigenous people is that we are coming with a gift of wisdom. The knowledge we have, one as the first scientists in multiple forms, the first engineers, the first architects, the first pharmacists, all of these things are here in this land. And right across our nation, we have Indigenous leaders, and many of them are amazingly younger leaders who are thinking about systems in a total different way. So what we're saying is that unless we are factoring in Indigenous wisdom, which is science, which is first law, which is all of these things, we are not going to right size the planet. Seriously. I was on a panel like this yesterday, and people were saying, well, you know, how do we do all these sorts of things? And how do we fix these systems? And I said, the first point is, yes, we go from the local to the regional, to the national, to the global, but we are living in a system, and that system is called Mother Earth. And we are planetary citizens, and we all have a responsibility and an obligation to look at how do we right size the planet. And that noise isn't coming from me, so someone hasn't got their mute button on. Um, so yeah, it would be good to mute yourself because you'll just throw my systems thinking out. But the point being is we all need each other. And the biggest challenge we have as human beings is how do we stop climate change spiraling later into climate chaos? How do we sit around the table and bring all of this wisdom in to think about why and how have we landed on the situation that we've landed on? And so my work is local, regional, national, global, but the voice of Indigenous people globally is saying that this ancient wisdom is a gift. We're not charging you. We want you to stop othering us and open your mind to the fact that, as someone said to me the other day, we're not revolutionaries, we are solutionaries. And so all of us, every one of us has a ripple effect on how we see the world, how we act in the world, how we become with the world. So I told you that when we are born, we are given a totem, a judge, a non-human being that we form a lifelong relationship with. And it's also about balance, because I can't eat a blue tongue lizard. So, you know, there's a way of doing this that brings us into contact with this. But one of the things that Mary and Michelle and I are exploring with other amazing people is this concept of first law, law of the land, not law of man. So these laws of the land, they come from nature. What do nature teach us as human beings? As a child, the elders teach us very, very early to look for the signs up in the sky, down in the ground, to be in tune with our environment, to look around and see what is happening. And I can say, I live on country. The river behind me is our most beautiful Fitzroy River, Matawara. It's very much in that space, and I'll come back to it. But we live in a world where we need harmony, we need balance. Having a judge, having first law teaches us about values, about ethics, about how we live in a world where people may not know, but Aboriginal people come from a society or a governance model of a lordal title. A lordal title means the absence of lords. So we didn't need anyone dictating us and telling us, this is how you're going to behave, this is what you're going to do. We had first law. And first law was told to us using animals. So animals became the voice of wisdom, of knowledge. And so these first laws teach us what are the values, what are the ethics, what are the codes of conduct, how do we live in a civil society? Most importantly, Aboriginal people come from a world of what we call polycentric governance, which means we self-regulated. These are the rules. This is what we're going to negotiate. This is how we will live together in peace and harmony. And this is how we will behave towards each other, towards our non-human family, towards the land, towards the rivers, towards all of these living things. So very, very important, a lordal title, the absence of lord. So we never had anyone dictating to us, this is what you got to do in your little estate. And this is what we self-regulated under a polycentric governance model, which means we had values, we had ethics that were taught to us from the land to teach us how to behave, how to have a kinship structure, how to have reciprocity, how to live in a world of a circular economy where multiple values help us to reach our full potential as human beings. So we need social capital, we need human capital, we need cultural capital, we need environmental capital, we need economic capital because we're living in a capitalist system. And so all of those forms of capital help us to live in a world where we can reach our full potential as human beings. So despite all of the qualifications, I said I went into nursing, I have 3 master's degrees, a PhD, just doing another one. It's so that we can learn more, that we can share more. And the challenge we have before us today is to think about not just the local, but the regional, the national, and the global. Because remember, I said that we are all planetary citizens. So even though I might be stuck in the Kimberley on the Fitzroy River, I am connected to a world called Mother Earth. And so we all have to have this ethics of care and ethics of love, of empathy. And that's what having a totem or a judge does. It teaches you to have empathy with the environment. It teaches you how to connect with nature. I mean, the Fitzroy River or the Matawara behind me is an amazing living system We do not talk about cultural flow in the Kimberley. We talk about living water systems because firstly, the land is alive. The rivers are alive. These are living systems. More than that, they hold memory. They hold the memory of the past, the present, and into the future. So we live with these living systems and we are so tuned in. And this is what we are trying to teach our non-Indigenous fellow Australians, that we want to teach you how to feel the country, how to read the country, how to be in the country. And that's not just in the Fitzroy River. That's in the Yarra River, that's in Melbourne, that's in Adelaide, that's in Sydney, that's in Melbourne. We want you to connect at the local level. We want you to get to know the land in which you are now calling your home. So many leaders, including Mary and myself, it's not a story where Indigenous peoples are saying, get back to where you came from. This is your home. We want you to have this sense of belonging, this sense of connection, this sense of, as Mary and I speak, a law of obligation to look after your country, to be a part of the solutions for how we right-size the planet. You know, many of our young people are out there going, they are actively rejecting the system of government that we have set up because it is failing. It is failing white people, let alone Aboriginal people. So we need a conversation where we need to be moving. And this is some of the amazing work that Michelle is doing around bioregional frameworks, around green prints. Many people do not realize that the Commonwealth government has mapped out bioregions for the whole of our country. So there's lots of, you know, these sorts of things out there, but how do we take policy and turn it into transformational change? And so one of the things I'm looking at with the Fitzroy River or the Matawara, those of you that have been involved in the Murray-Darling story will know that it's been a total failure, that there are Aboriginal people in, particularly around the Barker and Menindee and all those places, that are crying for their river system, that are in deep sorrow for their river system, because that lifeblood that is just such an amazing system, the Murray-Darling Basin that goes through all of those states and come out at the Kooyong Lakes, is an amazing system. And we have failed in our duty of care as fellow Australians to look after that system. So what we currently have right now is a few of those, what we call big greedy frogs, that have swallowed up all the water in the Murray-Darling Basin are on their way to the Fitzroy River. There are very, very big plans for how some of these people are going to come up here and swallow up the water with the illusion that they're going to grow cotton because the cotton seed is good cattle fodder. So I live in a world that is totally shrouded in what I call the illusion of probity, the pretense that there is fairness and justice and equity, not just for fellow Australians, but for Indigenous people. So we are now getting prepared. I've put up the Matawara website there. If you're very interested, you could go to that website. It has got amazing content. It's got films, it's got publication, it's got stories, it's got song. And we are doing an amazing job, because last year in July, we got together and we kind of thought, okay, we need to be out there. We need to be communicating our concerns. And so we, in terms of the Matawara Fitzroy River Council, which was established in 2018, which I am the chair of, we got together Aboriginal leaders from 6 independent nations that go all the way down that Fitzroy River. We got together, and in 2016, following 2016, we launched the Fitzroy River Declaration, a declaration with 8 points, the first instruments that was negotiated in regards to looking at Indigenous law and Crown law and saying these are the basic principles that we want engagement to happen in the Fitzroy River. So then 2016, I had an amazing opportunity. Michelle ran the first, I think, tribunal for nature in Brisbane, where we went into a court system, and people from all over the continent took in cases as earth defenders to bring a case to the tribunal. And so Matawara was obviously one of those stories. And then when I got back, we had another meeting, and one of our senior elders stood up in the meeting, which we had, you know, all the big wigs in their government, local government, people that were brokering, looking at how they're going to come and take the water. And one of our elders rose in the middle of the meeting and he said, you came, you stole the land, you made us slaves, and now you're back for the water. what is going to be left for blackfellas. So from that, what we're saying is that we need to have our elders guiding us with this critical thinking. They need to dream what these solutions are and put them out there in the cosmos. And we all together as fellow Australians need to work together, because this is a very big story. The Matawara or the Fitzroy River is National Heritage listed, which means it belongs to every one of you sitting on this panel. So every one of you have a duty of care and obligation to look at how we're going to develop this system, not just for now, but in our language, Bugaragara, for the past, the present, and the future, to inform our systems thinking about how do we do business a different way. And there may be time and a little bit later, but one of the big things for me in terms of where we take the local to the national to the global is exactly what Mary said. Democracy is failing. We do not have democracy in this country. Somebody said to me, we don't have democracy, we have bureaucracy. But what I'm saying is that we, in terms of all of us as Australians, we are bound by the crown. We are still answerable to a monarchy, not a democracy. The laws that we hold are administrative laws that dictate how all of our lives are regulated. So my dream is that, one, we stop othering Indigenous people. We take on the wisdom that is so lacking in our systems thinking. But your freedom as fellow Australians is dependent on our freedom. And the freedom that we are looking for, I am looking for, is that one day we will become brave and we will transition to a just energy transition, because we care about those people working in oil and gas. We care about those Australian families. How do we upskill? How do we uptool and transition to a just energy transition? So that's one of the big things. But the second point, and it will happen, because this is what Bugaragara means. We as Aboriginal people don't see time in a linear way. We see it in a circle. And many of the work that Mary and I have started, we will not see completed in our lifetime. And so we have faith that we speak these things out and we move it forward. But I dream that one day Australia will become a just republic, and that a lot of the problems that we are having around the country is because of the encroachment of state rights and the fact that local government is not in the federal constitution. And what I'm saying from my lived experience, and I have been the deputy shire president of Broome, which is quite a big shire, and I have learned a lot about local government. And what I've learned is that the model of local government is failing nationally. And my mandate is we need to have regional government. We need to have bioregional planning. We need a bioregional framework. And in the Kimberley and the work that I do, it's called the Dampier Lands. So the connectivity between freshwater, saltwater interface between two local governments. So I'm really strongly advocating the work that Michelle is leading around green prints and around bioregional frameworks. And I'm dreaming that all of the people that I work with, particularly in Notre Dame University and the Kimberley transition with Noarlunga, and my friends such as Anne Jennings and Sandra Wool-Taunton, that we will be brave enough to move into an opportunity to explore a bioregional framework. So really what the challenge is for today and for the world, and this is a big message that's coming out, is that we've ended up in the state that we've ended up because of the narcissistic epidemic of greed. Colonial capitalism is the rampant colonialism. So in order for all of us to be free, we need to look for new ways to do business. And what I'm saying is that it needs to be a bioregional framework. We all have a duty and an obligation to get to know where we are. And in lastly going, I hope that in our conversation, Mary, Alana, she may not be on the call, but Michelle, we are also launching on in July, on NAIDOC Week, we are launching the Regenerative Songline. Because what Mary and I find is that people contact us and they go, what are you doing? How do we get to do what you're doing? So Michelle hopefully will share with you today that we are creating a website with a regenerative map and inviting Indigenous co-design projects to come into that, so that you can look wherever you are and go, hey, I'm interested in what's happening in Tabulum. Hey, I'm interested in what's happening in Yungambear country or whatever. So that's a body of work that the three of us are working on, very passionate about it. But yeah, most of all, I want to say thank you for joining the website, because I think the most precious resource that we have, which we are all exhausting very, very quickly, is time. So I want to thank you for coming on board, for sharing your time with us. And I hope we will have time for discussion, but I want to just hand it on to Helena now. But, you know, this point that we are saying is that we need to create peace with Indigenous people and with nature. And I just want to give a plug, because in the Kimberley in 1618, when an Italian explorer came here and did a map of the Kimberley, he wrote in Italian language, land of peace. So we've come from a world of, sure, there was regulation, punishment if you did the wrong thing, but we have always lived from a peace perspective on our lands across the nation, connected by our songlines, connected by trade and ceremony. And so what we're saying is that this is an amazing country. The land is alive, it holds memory, and Indigenous people are extending their gift of wisdom and friendship to say, please stop othering us. You need the wisdom we have to help, one, right-size our nation, but two, right-size the planet. Kaleo Mabo, thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. Thank you, Mary and Anne, for opening up our discussions. I'm sure we're getting a lot of lovely feedback here. People are enjoying these important insights and wisdom. I'd now like to introduce Helena Norberg-Hodge, an absolutely wonderful champion of localization and challenging the negative aspects of capitalism and the very essence of modernity itself. So Helena, if you'd like to introduce yourself in whatever way you wish, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I'm very, very honored to be here with you today, with the three of you remarkable women. Very honored, and really hope we can collaborate more in the future. My work started really 45 years ago when I had the opportunity to get to know an ancient indigenous culture on the Tibetan plateau called Ladakh. It was a part of the world that had not been colonized and had not been developed in the modern era because it had been sealed off from the outside world. They were protected partly by the high Himalayas, living up at 12,000 feet in a desert. So when the British came into India, they weren't particularly interested in these 100 villages of about 100,000 people spread out in the desert. I arrived there just as the area had been open to the outside world. I was coming because I was a linguist. I was thinking I was going to be there for 6 weeks to help make an anthropological documentary. And I fell in love. I had never, ever encountered people who were so radiantly happy, who were so deeply confident, who were so incredibly alert and alive, intelligent. I fell in love. I ended up giving up my job in Paris. I stayed, and as I went through the region, the whole region, never ever did I hear of hunger. There was no such thing as unemployment. Didn't exist, had never existed. And I was witness to what happened when Ladakh was being developed. So I saw the basic elements of what is a global capitalist system. So when we talk about systems, we will not hear in academia about the most important destructive system of all, which is the global economic system. We know, as we're saying here, that the real economy is Mother Earth. This global system of Gaia is ultimately going to have the power, is ultimately going to be the only way we're going to support ourselves. But from the very beginnings of this capitalist system, we're talking about global players, global traders who, through enclosures in Europe, pushed people away from the land, destroyed their human scale institutions of governance. They're decentralized and localized, bioregional, of course. But I think in contrast to the global system, I'm tending to use localizing towards the bioregional embeddedness in Earth that we need for the future. But this global system then enslaved people on the other side of the world. Genocide. If you didn't want to go along with this, you were simply killed off. And what you were going along with was allowing some global traders in Europe to run the world. And that economic trajectory, that global economic trajectory, I believe that's the missing piece, that we're not looking at that enough. I ended up setting up a forum on globalization. So I worked with people, unfortunately, no Australian, but we had people otherwise from every continent studying the impact of trade treaties over the last 30 years. And we saw that with these trade treaties, what was happening was that our governments were being pressured to hand over all their wealth and rights to global corporations, banks and corporations. The trade in money being one of the most important ingredients in this. But don't make the mistake of just studying the financial system. It's really important to understand in a very grounded, indigenous way, looking at what happens to the food system. It's probably the most instructive and the clearest sort of black and white issue. What's been happening to that food system is that, as I said, going back 500 years, people driven away from the land, no longer allowed to grow food for their own needs or harvest or hunt food from their region. That was always diversified, diversity, with that living biodiversity that people depended on. What started happening almost immediately with this global economy was the imposition of monoculture, bigger and bigger monocultures, because with the long distances, that is absolutely structurally essential. When you instead shorten the distance between the land and people who are eating the food, between, if you like, the farm and the consumer, then you suddenly get a market that pressures towards diversification. So this shortening of distances is what we're talking about with localization, that we should all become alert to essentially rebuilding more diversified, self-reliant economies worldwide. And in order to function, in order to be sustainable, they need to be based on local knowledge, more eyes per acre of land. And they actually need to be based on more human labor, or if you like, they need to be based on job-rich ways of dealing with the land, with the animals. So what's happening in the new food movement, in the local food movement worldwide, is that young people are loving leaving the city, leaving a job where they sit in front of the screen all day, whether they be doctors or lawyers or IT experts. There is a micro trend towards saying, my body doesn't like this. My soul doesn't like this. I'm isolated from nature. I am isolated from other people. This disconnection from life is also a disconnection from human connections, from community, and from the living world, the rest of the living world. So this trend back to the land, this particularly around food and farming, is a very important central wheel in starting to turn this global economic system around towards one where through local knowledge systems, people start hearing, listening to the lore of the land. We cannot do that sitting at a computer at Harvard, thinking that we know the biodiversity of the world. We know nothing. I was on a stage with a woman from Unilever who was telling me how they were now so proud of the fact that they were going to shift away from 10 commodities, 10 food commodities being exported and used worldwide. They were going to increase that number to 20. I told them, in the world of the localized food systems that I'm working with, we have biodiversity that hasn't even been counted yet. It hasn't even been named or labeled yet. We are talking about a multitude that we are only beginning to comprehend now. And I'm hoping that at this late stage of this system, this global economic system that has wrought so much destruction, that we will be willing to look at that system, to just identify the basic structures of that, to be very, very clear that we all need to collaborate with the rebuilding of local knowledge systems and local economies. Now, bioregional is one of the reasons why I like to use local is that when you're talking about local, you can start looking at how many miles has this traveled. And local is not an absolute, but the whole point is we're trying to short distances in order to stimulate biodiversity and in order to decentralize economic power. I would argue that if we do not decentralize economic power, we are doomed. I would argue that when we look at the mess of what's happening, you were talking about the mess of the so-called democracy in Australia. I want you to know that in my native country of Sweden and in all of Scandinavia, we have witnessed over the last 30, 40 years, the same destructive trajectory. Our governments are no longer listening to people. And with our perspective in the Forum on Globalization and in the localization movement, what I can also tell you is I became aware that in my very progressive country of Sweden, where there was no real poverty, where women had quite high status, the status of women and the status of the feminine was still nothing like as high as it was in indigenous Ladakh. In that indigenous way of life, for a multitude of reasons, women and the feminine have much higher status. It goes together with the earth having higher status. What had happened in Sweden is through modernity, people had been pushed off the land using lots of fossil fuels. Our governments pushed people off the land and then put them into high-rise buildings, also using lots of fossil fuels. Now, those fossil fuels are costing us the earth. And yet, in the climate debate, we're not talking about fossil fuels. We are talking about carbon. Why? Because the international negotiations, even with many well-intentioned people at the UN, the framing is done by big business. And it's not evil people. There are many good people. That woman from Unilever who was proud of increasing biodiversity was not doing that necessarily out of bad intention. She might have liked having a very highly paid job, but we're really talking now about a blindness of this big, big global economic system that we are not allowed to talk about. Media won't let us talk about it. Academia won't let us talk about it. We, women of the earth, must talk about it. And when we do, we don't want to dwell on the problems of that system, because Mary, what you're doing, and Anne, what you're doing is so vitally important for a global discussion, of why humanity must re-indigenize by going back to those bioregional structures and the local knowledge systems, the decentralization of power that is structurally a way of regaining the status of Mother Gaia and of women not as masters, although it may be that in prehistoric times they were actually masters. I feel so privileged that I was able to live in a culture where the status of women, as I say, and when I say status of women, I want to say again, it was the status of the feminine. It had to do with the fact that this way of life was also based on intergenerational community. Intergenerational community. You never segregated 5-year-olds into a group to sit in a room all day with their peer group. Now, this is a structural way of creating competition, anger, and violence. What you saw was that 5-year-old boys were carrying their baby siblings or baby animals. They actually were involved in nurturing and caring for life as they were growing up. So they maintained their feminine side. What you saw was that in the intergenerational structure, everybody was learning and teaching their entire lifetime in a cyclical way, and in a way that meant that everyone had meaning, everyone had a role to play. And of course, everyone knew that the older you were, the more knowledge you had. And also, by the way, talking about knowledge, what Anne, what you were saying, and also Mary, it was so clear that in these cultures, people recognize their limitations. In their language, they spoke with a certain authority about things that they had experienced. They would never talk about something on the other side of the world with authority. Their language wouldn't let them. They couldn't say, my garden is doing well, and use the same verb to say, in China, it is like this. You couldn't say that. If you spoke about China, distant realities that you had never experienced, you would say, it is said that. The language showed you that there was no certitude. What modernity has done is to turn this upside down, and in academia, we are now suddenly told we can't speak from experience. It's anecdotal, it's meaningless. The centralization of power has been linked to the destruction of respect for experiential knowledge, and of course, the destruction of the experiential knowledge that was the foundation of a healthier, localized economic structure. I'd also just like to say that part of what I experienced was that in a world where technology was subjugated to adaptation, again, to place, adaptation to place, it meant that when you built a house out of mud in a particular region, you knew that you had to put some straw in because the mud wasn't strong enough. In another region, you would have to make the bricks larger. In another region, you knew that even that animals that had been born and grown up in a particular region where the soil was sandy and soft, you couldn't take those animals to another region where it was stony and hard. This knowledge about the adaptation of the animals and the plants and the building materials was of fundamental importance, and the technologies were adapted to those diverse needs. I know that for many people it will sound maybe ridiculous that we're going to go back to these kinds of technologies, but what I do hope you will agree about is that we have allowed techno systems to be created that were not created by human beings. They were created by systems of extractive capital, giant institutions investing in genetic engineering in order to be able to extract profit as people grow food around the world, creating seeds that will not even survive, live beyond one season with their terminator genes. We really have to step back and recognize that these techno systems are a major part of the destruction. We now are using one of them, which is the information technologies of using this Zoom and computer screen. We have to distinguish between the need today for global communication, global collaboration, and global commerce. I don't know if I'll see anything like this before I die, but I really hope we will come to recognize that as an economic tool, this internet structure and the financial casino that thrives on that speedy trade in currencies, speedy creation of make-believe money, is one of the most dangerous tools that has ever been created. And Bitcoin and these other alternatives, supposed alternatives, very naive if we believe that they can be genuinely beneficial. Real wealth comes from the land. We have to start looking at a symbol of wealth, money, which is useful. I'm not suggesting we eliminate money. I don't even think we have to eliminate private property altogether. But I do think we have to really start looking at how we can create systems where there is the visible and there is some kind of accountability. So for now, we need to use this tool, but please let's work together not to allow its escalation. Now with 5G and all kinds of other pressures to increase our dependence on this technology, to me, this is a fork in the road after COVID. Do we become even more dependent on these technologies, or do we move in the direction of a more localized future where we become more dependent on the land and on each other? And interestingly enough, in a certain way, the choice is between robots or humanity. And of course, humanity embedded in the earth. But there is this human scale, human pace. We need to be able to slow down, to think, to see, to nurture, to love. It takes time to love. It takes time to care. We are all victims of time pressures now, which emanate directly from this global economic system and the techno systems that have been imposed on us. We didn't ask for them. There was never a movement begging for a new Walmart or a new techno system. Now maybe some children want new computer games, but these systems come from this very centralized, very dangerous mix of money and technology and blindness. It's not so much ill will as it is blindness. I just want to finish by saying that I think we can see that these men who started with the enclosures, slavery, genocide, they had overtly misogynist, racist values, anti-nature values, overtly. However, today, the rulers in this global casino system, many of them don't. The values have improved. What has not improved is a deep, broad understanding of how this economic system functions. Once we can help to lay that clear, I am quite confident that the majority of humanity wants to see change in the direction of a more ecological, a more feminine, a more just future that respects the earth and that respects deeply those indigenous people who demonstrated ways of living in and with the earth for thousands upon thousands of years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helena. There's a lot of comments, discussions. Everyone's really fascinated by these conversations, and I'm very grateful to you all. We've gone from Mary's overview, particularly of the Relationist ethos and the law of obligation, and the first laws that Anne spoke about, and the need for bioregional, local, and a change in the way that we look at country and the way we care. I'm now going to change hats and go from being the helper and the facilitator of the conversation to giving a short presentation about the work we do. And one of the reasons that I guess I'm so indebted and in such great awe of the three women that I'm joining the panel with today is the work that we do inside AILA and my other networks absolutely needs these voices of wisdom, these areas of critique, so that we can create something different and something better into the future. I'm really visual, and while I can talk, most people would joke I can talk under concrete. What I'm going to do is share a few slides because I actually want to do almost a little summary of some of the things that particularly Mary and I, but also Anne, have been thinking about, and the things that we do inside AILA as non-Indigenous Australians, critiquing the system that we've been born into, but really turning it around and doing some really incredible positive analysis of a different way forward. And I see some questions in the comments and to me privately about what do we do, particularly as non-Indigenous people, what's our role? How can we be part of a much better future? And we'll talk about that a lot more in our discussion. But just bear with me, I'll just show you some slides. It just helps me to put myself back in the spot. So I'm very grateful to be able to be part of this discussion because for me, it's nice to tell my story every now and then. I spend so much time burrowed away doing the work or organizing events to bring amazing people together. To share my story is, I think, really nice. I was born in the middle of Queensland. I'm a bush kid. I grew up with a deep and passionate love of kangaroos and emus out on the open plains. It rained 1 or 2 days a year where I grew up. So I am absolutely passionate about, I guess, arid zones and places where water is very, very, very precious. This is a really not a very good quality photo, but it's a photo I took on the Alice River out near Barcaldine, where I grew up. I was born in Longreach. We lived in towns that absolutely relied on the Great Artesian Basin. They literally wouldn't exist without the water supply that the colonists had been digging up and using with bores. But the reason I like to mention where I come from is being a country kid. I'd always been, I guess, in love with the living world. We'd go out with my grandparents and my parents. We'd go walking into the bush, sitting for very long picnics, just watching the birds and the rather remarkable animals that lived in that area. But as I grew up and was lucky enough to get edumacated, as my daughter used to call it, studying at ANU, studying both history and law and touching into some economics, all of the deep concerns that I had as a young person growing up, going bush, growing up watching David Attenborough documentaries, my deep concern was how we were using up the earth, destroying so much. And although I'm 50, and I know that in this group, I'm a younger person than others, the 30 years that I've been working on social change and environmental awareness, the changes we've seen are terrifying. There's a lot to be optimistic about. There is a lot of change happening, but the opportunities that my culture lost in the 90s by not acting on climate change, the things that my culture has created are just a cause for deep despair. But my call is to sort of take that grief, take that despair and keep working, because I have been seeing, particularly in the last 10 years, a phenomenal turnaround in a lot of the thinking of non-Indigenous peoples and a lot of people even in power. But growth economics, exactly as Helena said, and many others have alluded to, the notion that began in the 1500s in Europe, that when you run out of stuff, you keep invading and you go forth and you take other people's resources, you take other people. This notion has not stopped. We see this in the space race. We see this in space engineers' discussions about all the things they want to do to our beloved moon. And every now and then I'm invited onto panels about what if the moon had its own rights, you know, and all these really bizarre and you would think unnecessary conversations. But I like to remind people who just assume they have a right to go to the moon and a right to melt the frozen water on the dark side of the moon, which we know nothing about, is a reminder that even 500 years ago, people thought they knew what they were doing when they invaded other places. This expansionist mindset, for whatever reason, that emerged in my cultures. My ancestry is Irish and British. It causes me great ponder. And Mary Graham and I, we often sit and just chat. Why are the cultural worldviews of her people and my people so profoundly different? And this is something, as a non-Indigenous Aussie, I feel I can offer back to people who may be pondering the same thing. Why is it that we've done this? And why is it we haven't turned it around yet? So as a young person studying environmental law and a whole bunch of environmental governance, this image really captured how I felt about the environmental crisis. It just felt like there's so much of a mess. How do we unpick this? How do we even pick a place to start moving forward? And I would admire people who had a passion for koalas or a passion for reforestation in this one place. And I would envy those who felt deeply connected to place like Aboriginal folks that are my friends and colleagues. But I always felt like I was the lost white tribe. This idea that I was born into a country that wasn't allegedly mine. And how do I become part of a solution instead of endlessly being part of a problem? So this big ball of mess was definitely how I felt in my 20s as a young, non-Indigenous Aussie, really trying to find her way, both as an individual wanting to find meaning, but also really to be useful and to be able to contribute back. So I was lucky enough to spend many, many years working on climate change, working around the world in both the UK and the US on energy issues for climate, for communities and businesses to try to reduce their impact. But it still didn't find an answer for where we came from and why it was. In 2008, I was lucky enough to come across this book, And in 2009, I met with a number of other lawyers who were interested in earth jurisprudence or earth laws. And the only reason I mention this book is that at the time, it took that big ball of confusion for a relatively younger person and helped me find a cohesive framework to really think about, well, how do we understand the problems? And how do we, in my case, someone who's interested in systems change and the structural forms of our society, how do we contribute to pushing back at that? So Thomas Berry was a remarkable thinker and writer. And I often joke that he was a lovely old white man looking back at the old white system that his peers had created and maintained. But he critiqued modern industrial societies as being fundamentally human-centered and growth-focused. And in this book, The Great Work, he calls to people from our tradition, my tradition, non-Indigenous peoples whose own ancestors flung them into far-flung places, making them feel for a little while that they didn't belong until they worked out they really did. But in this book, he critiques these underpinning establishments, and he gives a systems analysis of why industrialized societies have caused so much harm. He looked to law and government, economics, education, and religion. And it's interesting, although this book is obviously American, and I'm normally a little bit more interested in Australian stuff, let's put it that way, I found it a really useful framework, and it actually inspired the creation of my own organization. So in 2011, a group of us, we were started as environmental lawyers, but now AILA is extremely multidisciplinary. We were very interested in how could we take these underpinning structures as a starting point for really pushing back for systems change, not just looking at one piece of the puzzle, but trying to look across everything that industrialized societies, expansionist, colonialism, capitalism, all of these isms have created on our beautiful planet. I won't go into the detail, but under each of these very fluid themes, we kind of group a lot of our work. The two I wanted to pick up on here was the idea of changing culture, the deep need to change the cultural worldview, the privileged expectations that my culture puts onto Mother Earth and to other people, and to really shift that back into a place of humility. And the other one I just want to point out is creating alternatives. What we would find more and more was endless critique of the problems and small but very important efforts to address it. But there weren't enough positive ways of really shifting the system and showing alternative, viable alternative governance systems or economic systems or legal systems. People seem to be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than patching up the Titanic and jumping off to another ship. So it's this area that we became very interested in. But in a nutshell, and somebody asked this in their comments, my work, my personal love of the living world, which came from being a bush kid and has just grown and grown as I've gotten older, this is what my work is about in terms of how we're trying to shift Westerners or non-Indigenous peoples, folks who don't think in an earth-centered way. How do we take this hierarchical, human-centered, patriarchal system that values the living world only so much as a piece of property or values living animals based on the brain size or their sentience? How can we shift all of these now very entrenched ideas to an earth-centered worldview? And of course, we have a huge amount to learn from our older cousins, Indigenous peoples who have never lost the common sense and the beauty and the wonder of living in harmony with nature. But we also have to take responsibility. Often I hear a lot of non-Indigenous people saying, oh, well, just follow Aboriginal people, they know what to do. And I think that that's sometimes really unfair, that we're in a system that has persecuted and killed and demonstrably destroyed aspects of Indigenous societies all around the world. And now we're pointing back and saying, now it's your responsibility to lead us into the future. I think we all have to take responsibility for the space that we've been born into, the culture we come from, the peers we work with, and try to move ourselves and our own peers and communities into something much different and much more positive. So the last thing that I want to say, and I really don't want to talk for too long, is I often use these 3 maps to remind people, actually there's 4 in this one, this incredible nation state, which, as Anne pointed out, we're still connected to the monarchy in Britain, which is a huge embarrassment and it's just horrible. But this remarkable nation state, which compared to many other places in the world is extremely rich, and is extremely peaceful, give or take huge, endless ongoing issues from colonisation. But this system, this rather beautiful place, is built upon the absolute millennia of caring for country that the Indigenous peoples of this continent carried out and continue to carry out. And whether you look at our economic debt, or look at, and can I just remind everyone to mute? Sorry, I can't mute that person while I'm talking. This governance system that Mary Graham was talking about, the Relationist Ethos, these remarkable a plethora of communities, local council equivalents, all looking after their own local place and interacting with each other through the Relationist Ethos, is definitely something that we should not just learn from or listen to the wisdom, but really try to rethink our own system, to work in solidarity with local people, Indigenous people, to rethink how we do what we do in Australia. Because it's, and I won't go into this too much, but I give talks about understanding literally the 1,000 years of hierarchical, male-dominated legal systems that came to Australia. When we talk about the patriarchy, it's not just someone banging a drum or standing on a soapbox. The legal system literally was built by men to support their firstborn sons. Nothing went to women. All of these structures were built in the British Isles, you know, during the Middle Ages and even before. So what came to Australia, what was rolled out through these straight lines and imaginary political boundaries, came from a very particular kind of way of thinking. And this map, which is often just a simple way to show what this 240 years of governance has done, all the white stuff is all the original life forms gone. I mean, and all that stuff is legal. None of the stuff that you see there, none of that destruction is illegal or immoral. In our legal system, this stuff was absolutely advocated for through a pro-growth, pro-development way of being. And this final map is the bioregional map that Western scientists have started to, well, not started, have been developing over a couple of decades. It's just another way of thinking about this place, particularly for non-Indigenous people, to really recognise that this continent is made up of fairly remarkable, unique ecosystems. And if you want to be an earth-centred human, starting with what Mother Earth tells us about herself and working up for a governance system is a good place to start. So all I wanted to finish up on is we do a lot of analysis of the different legal systems. And when Mary and I were talking, and working with Mary over the last few years has been a huge privilege, probably one of the greatest professional privileges of my life, also personal. But Mary pointed out that first laws show that the land is the source of the law. And it's the template for what we can call second laws, the laws between people, the relationist ethos between people. Earth jurisprudence also talks about this great law, laws of the natural world. And it's pretty important to remember that Western law literally has no first laws. It has no deep earth ethic, whether it's in caring for country or looking after each other. We do not look to the living world as a source of knowledge, and we should. And if we do, we'll find answers and a rethinking of our systems that I think will be healthy for everybody. And that's the blue-banded bee, which lives in my garden. And I'd always like to end on the bee because I'm obviously obsessed with plants and animals everywhere, but particularly this little fella that lives in my garden, because the females dig little burrows. And I used to sit in the summers and watch them coming and going out of their burrows. And I swear it was magic. I mean, you can't get anything better than that. And if you have a legal system that doesn't see these bees as living and magical and amazing, then there's something deeply wrong with your culture. That's all I can say. So I'll now take my hat off as a speaker. Thank you so much for letting me talk about the work we do. And now what I'd like to do is open up, if you've put questions in the chat, I've been tracking them. And what I might do in a moment is I'll begin with some of the questions that came in, but do keep jotting them in if you wish. So to my lovely speakers, Mary, to Anne and to Helena, I might just start asking a few questions. So, I've got a lovely question from Catherine. She asked, could Mary speak about the Uluru Statement within the context of local governance? I'm wondering if that might just be what do you make of the Uluru Statement, or what do you think we should do with it? Did you want to comment on that, Mary? Oh, you're on mute, Mary. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, I have to confess, I haven't actually followed properly the Uluru Statement idea, partly because, well, for several things. When I've ever talked about it with a whole lot of other Aboriginal people in different parts of the country, actually, they have the same kind of idea that it's a great idea, but that coming to some kind of agreement with government is probably not the first thing that people would think about. And I must say, I tend to be the same way. I look at working on our old agreements with our neighbours, our Aboriginal neighbours, all the different clan groups, language groups all around. That's what we're looking at, and we're currently working on that. We're not all that interested. It's not that treaty is not a good thing or anything like that, but that looking at government and being invited or not being invited, being ignored, to have some kind of presence in the Constitution is not the greatest thing that we're waiting for. You know, it's us building our strength again, and our strength is in our the relations between ourselves, our own mobs, because we've been been through so much, you know, over 200 years. I just read somebody saying 40,000 years of stability, peace, stability, 200 years of nightmares, you know. So we've got to get to it with ourselves, with each other, how to fix our own problems too. Do you know what I mean? There's dysfunctionalism. And one of the things that we all do agree with is we understand and get back to our own laws of obligation to land, principally, but to each other all the time. You know, that's more important than anything else. Maybe we might get to having an agreement of some sort later, you know, but it's not the most important thing, having this agreement with government, you know, because simply because the reality is that they always write the agenda. They always write the rules, don't they? The terms of reference and so on and so on. So while they're saying no at the moment, well, that's only to be expected. And when they are, probably in many years to come, interested, they'll want to lay down what the terms of reference are too. So it ignores completely the fact that we're probably one of the very first people who know how to run a country, actually, properly, you know, how to run it in the right way, in the ethical way, and so on. So that's only starting to be realised now. But I think government style, you know, the state with a small s, I think they'll always have problems with that, always. And that's why, if I could ask, could I turn this around to ask Helena a question?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, if that's all right. I was really interested in what you were saying, and I've been thinking of myself along the lines of the state itself. You know, I know old Marx had an idea that the state might wither away, but they're fighting tooth and nail. Of course, that's definitely not going to happen if they can help it. But I also talk about a civilizational culture, not a civilizational state, because to me the big problem, you know, the rock in the middle of the road is the state. And so what our old system is a civilizational culture. What kind of human being do you want to have this relationship with land? Proper relationship, you know. That's saying about, there's a saying about how to arriving at a condition of being worthy of what's proper, you know. And I always think of Aboriginal people in this way. That's what they've always looked at. That's the kind of society you have to have, you know. So where does the state go from here, do you think, Helena? What should happen to it?
Well, I basically think that right now in the situation we're in is that the interlinked corporations and the banking system is a more dangerous system than the visible nation state government. But it's complex. I think we need to be using the mechanism of the nation state, which at least pretends to be
Yeah, you can't get away
democratic,
from it.
in order to get power back from the corporations, so that any power is at least visible. And
Yes.
we cannot allow this accumulation of power and wealth at this global level in institutions we don't even know the name of. However, we can simultaneously insist that the nation state should be decentralizing power to the regions and localities. So, you know, because we want them to have more power than the global corporations, we want them to have less power than local, and we want to have our local councils have more rights to respond to us. But I have found, even in my work with local food economies, like I've helped to start lots of farmers markets. For instance, here in Byron, I helped to start 4 farmers markets. And I have to say, even there, the local government tends to get in the way. Almost all the good things come from the grassroots. And so, you know, we have to decentralize the power.
Decentralize,
But not do that vis-a-vis these giant corporations.
No,
and that's
no,
why
no.
I also even would argue that many indigenous groups are unwise to try to reclaim total power over their land as a small tribe, because it makes it much easier for a corporation to come in, and with only $500,000, they might be able to buy some of the young members of the tribe. Whereas we need to come together as a big group to with the agenda of protecting the earth, and ultimately protecting our rights as earth citizens. So it's a little bit complicated, but I think we can have clarity. I would love to discuss more with you, Mary, about that. Hopefully we can meet with.
Yes,
I would love that. That would be a great honor.
That would
Absolutely.
be great. Thank you.
Thank you, darlings. I have a question for Anne. Anne, would it work to encourage all Australians, as a social media campaign or something, to be given a totem to look after, to help change mindsets and connect people to the country more meaningfully? And perhaps that's a broader question too. How do we encourage people to care for country?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And it's something that I have been thinking about, and it's something I've actually done. So I'm just about to launch another visible conversation, and it's called Eco Connect. And so what has happened is I've met an amazing man who's working with me. And one of the things we're doing is we've created a new website called Eco Connect. And it's not up functioning at the moment, but this is what it's about. You come in and you say, yes, I want to Eco Connect with Australia or Amazon or anywhere in the world. And through this process, we will connect you to a totem or a judge or a non-human creature. And you will get to know that creature, and you will fall in love with it, because you will learn about its characteristics, its value in our world. So I have just started that project, and that's the way we're going, is, you know, how do we connect with what you know? How do we connect with these amazing things? And so we've been collecting amazing photography. In the earlier link, I put a link in from The Guardian, where, you know, I've got another colleague who's a very beautiful person on this call, and I just noticed her and sent her a little hello button system. And so there's these amazing things. Part of the canoe trip down the Fitzroy River at the beginning of the year, you know, they were going through spiders and rheas on there and flicking off these spiders that were about the size of a saucer, and learning to live in that connect. And so my son on the journey took a whole lot of photos. He was bit by a centipede, so he photographed the centipede before he killed it. But you know what I mean? This is what we're doing. So it's called Eco Connect. It's just about to go live, happening globally, and I brought it back to our nation. And so what happens is you pay $100 to get on, and then that funds goes into supporting Indigenous works on the land, but you get to connect. And what we're going to create is these hubs all around different places, where if we find a town that's got 6 to 10 people who are eco-connected, and they get together and they talk about their species and all of these things. So I'm just saying, watch out for that. It's coming to you. It's coming to Australia. We're just about to mobilize it and hit the public button. But yeah, we thought it was a great way to connect people, because this is what we're saying. The totem teaches us an ethics of care, to love, and to learn about a creature from a non-human perspective, so our worldview and our systems thinking can be enlightened. So watch that space, EcoConnect. It'll cost you $100, but it'll change your life, and your money is going to a good cause in terms of being able to support Indigenous projects, particularly around the country. So, yep. Somebody said to me, there is no new thought as a human being. Whatever the journey we've been on, somebody has had this question before us and responded. So from that perspective, yes, hello, we are getting eco-connected. Those of you that want to get a Judinge or a totem, watch for that, because it's just about to go live in the next couple of weeks. Thank you for your question.
Anne.
Now you can do something about it.
Yeah, there's actually been a couple of questions about the website. Do you have a website yet, or not yet? Oh, well.
No, we're just setting up the bank account, so everything's legal and transparent. So once that's done, we'll hit the button and we'll go live with that. But we'll connect you, because as I said, the Regen Songline that we're launching in July, Michelle's put the website there, get to know it, but EcoConnect will be a great way to connect. So just watch for those words and keep searching on Dr. Google, because Dr. Google knows everything, this system.
Thank you so much, Anne. We have a couple more questions. I'm just going to go back to the beginning. So the question for Elena, thank you for your insightful talk. Can you please talk about local and Indigenous people dealing with climate change and sustainability? This question's from Prerna, who's the founder of a dialogue from India.
Yes, well, I work very closely with a researcher, climate activist, a woman named Camila Moreno from Brazil. And she, like Anne, she's got lots of degrees. I think she's got 3 PhDs. Anyway, she's been at all the climate negotiations for the last 11 years. And she's working with lots of local groups that are aware, first of all, that they should not fall for this carbon framing, because it makes it extremely difficult for small farmers and ordinary people. It's been framed in order to allow corporations to create a tradable commodity. And the Paris Agreement doesn't even talk about fossil fuels, when it would make a lot of sense for us to be talking about reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. So the sort of Indigenous groups and the local groups that we're working with around the world are very focused on building up that local food economy that I was talking about, because they realize that in the global food economy, where we are importing and exporting the same product, Australia imports wheat from England and exports wheat to England. Right now, they're exporting 20 tons of bottled water to England, while importing 20 tons of bottled water from England. And this is going on routinely across the world. From Australia, fish is flown to China to be deboned. Macadamia nuts from Byron Bay are flown to be cracked open, flown back again. Apples flown from the UK to South Africa to be washed, flown back again. This is going on across the world. So I hope you will all look at our little video on the website, the worldlocalizationday.org website. We just made a 3-minute little video where we look at the global food system as being the biggest contributor to climate change, and that localized food systems is one of the most strategic things you can do, not only to reduce emissions, but to reduce plastic, to reduce the refrigeration, all just enormous risks to the health of Gaia and ourselves, because the global food system is also what's driving monocultures, which require toxic pesticides, fungicides, herbicides that are killing us and killing the biome of the soil. So focusing on the food economy is the most important, whether you're from a traditional culture or anywhere you live. You can start from Sydney, you can start from Melbourne. We have helped to start local food schemes there, farmers markets, community supported agriculture. So I think what's really important about this is that we need to practice big picture activism to search out where do we find the genuinely deep, holistic analyses that will help us make a systemic shift. And I have to say, Michelle, has now directed what I see as the most advanced new economy movement in the industrialized world. And I believe it's because it's a woman who's working with Indigenous women, whereas most of the people in other countries concerned with the new economy tend to be men, and they tend to be focused on technology, not on the land, the water, the people. I'd also just quickly like to say one more thing though. I worry a little bit that we are forgetting the enormous benefits to human beings of this earth-centered perspective. And I am very keen that we bring that in, because I see so many people traumatized, suffering, whether it's from addiction, depression, epidemics of suicide among young people. In Ladakh, where I've worked for over a 40-year period, suicide was something that might have happened one in a generation for some strange reason. It just didn't really exist. Now we have one a month, and it's young people pushed into this education path to compete and strive in the city, losing contact with community and nature, and so competitive and so time pressured, and all the time their identity being made to feel worthless, because you have to look like the stars, you have to be wealthy, you have to be beautiful, you have to have everything. And so I think this human element, I also just want to mention that our program this week on World Localization Day program, which is a week-long program, I had a long conversation with Gabor Mate, who is a very interesting physician from Canada, who ended up studying more and more mental illness. He was a physician originally, but mental illness, including addiction, suicide, and he agrees completely with me that we are, and with us, because he understands that the indigenous cultures were the healthy cultures that are models for us. They lived in the way that we have evolved. And as he says, we are hardwired for that life. And that for him is very importantly about stronger community, collaborative, intergenerational community structures. That's how we shape a healthy identity for our children. So there's very, very important lessons there.
Thank you, Helena. Just before I move to another question, I just wanted to follow up. I think it's very linked to your discussion about food and some of your answers you just said, but a lovely person has said, a question for Helena. I'm a farmer in Gippsland, Victoria. What do you consider are the most powerful steps I can take towards localization?
Well, please link up with the local food movement. So you as a single farmer, it's very difficult to do things on your own, because you as a farmer, just like mothers and parents in this techno-economic system, the two most important functions we can possibly perform, how we bring up our children and how we raise our food, which, in this modern system, those two important roles have been marginalized to nothing. So you are, you're in a position where you've been marginalized in terms of identity, but also financially, just like, the mother's work doesn't exist. And the way to bring that back into a healthy balance is not to try to compete in the global system, but to start creating those more localized structures. Just like mothers can so benefit by linking up with other families to start supporting each other and really caring for each other. So I'm sure that if you look for local food initiatives, you might be able to find some. You could also write to us. We might be able to help you. This is one of the things that we do in our organization.
Thank you, Helena. And just a little plug for Nina. Then we've basically worked really hard to create this national network built on distributed governance, which is a flash way of saying lots of little hubs where people are in charge of their own activities. And our food hub includes people like Nick Rose from Sustain, and Joel Orchard from Future Feeders and Community Supported Agriculture, etc. So if you get stuck, always email Nina, N-E-N-A, at neweconomy.org.au, and we can try to connect you with someone somewhere to help out. A couple more questions and then we'll start to wrap up. So JP has asked a question for all of us, and I might start with Mary. The question is, much of what we've been touching on is the cultural overlay of often what's not questioned. What are the unconscious, unquestioned assumptions, seems like largely economic ones, but also scientific, that you would change most urgently? Mary, what do you think, particularly, I guess, industrialised societies rather than non-Indigenous Indigenous folks should be thinking about questioning and challenging? And you're on mute, Mary, sorry about that.
I'm sorry, look, just say that again. What?
What kind of assumptions in industrialized societies do you think we should question and challenge the most? You know?
Oh, everything. No, we'll start off with everything. And then, narrow it down. But I suppose this, I don't know, the utter controlling thing of it all, industrial society. We've all been, what's that word, atomized, and it goes on. It's an ongoing thing all the time. And what Helena was talking about before, the local and comparing it to family, local food, comparing it to family. Well, the relationalist, what she was talking about is the relationalist ethos. You know what I mean? Something that starts like that, against an industrial, materialistic, severe kind of way of looking at society. But the feminine, or the female, she is, it's in her body, which is why women have to run things too. Do you know what I mean? Right there alongside its balanced, gender balanced structure, governance, and so on and so on, because she stands for relationalism. Whether or not a woman has children, or wants to have children, or can have children, or doesn't even like children, doesn't really matter. Her body and mind bones are made for it, actually, so she embodies this. So women have to have this power. And I don't know if people know I don't know if it's all over the whole country, but the sun is female in our Aboriginal kind of thinking here. The sun is female and the moon is male. Actually, quite often it's the other way around, So the power of women, but it all comes back to relationalism, a relationalist ethos. So relationalism is everywhere, and the relationalist ethos is there. The law of obligation arises from that. And the funny thing is, though, that the law of obligation could be, well, see, I see it when somebody says, can you see it in the Western world? I wouldn't say no, absolutely not. In many ways I do. But for example, I used to have to explain, I had American students for a while, quite a long time actually, over years, and I would talk about that the idea of the National Health Service, from our point of view, that is a law of obligation being enacted out, a huge big policy like that at the National Health Service. They're looking after people who are poor, doesn't cost any money, it was very high quality health care and so on. So they're looking at, there's no insiders and outsiders. There's a hierarchy, but only in an administrative sort of sense. So to me, it looked like that. I had to really try and explain that to young Americans who thought it was a communist plot, actually, National Health Service. They actually thought that, Yeah, very sad, But other little policies like little bridges and tunnels for small furry beasties to be saved from becoming roadkill. That's a law of obligation. there's all kinds of things where the law of obligation it's a very large view of society and of living in urbanized areas and so on too, and especially in policy making, and I just think that you could do this on like you were saying before, bioregional. Every now and then something comes up where people who live in certain suburbs are trying to save their creek or something, or some development they don't want to. Well, when they arm themselves with this relationalist ethos sort of law of obligation idea. They get together, save it, and so on. And all they can do is have protests, of course. But I would try and make that a general system everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and that goes along exactly with that local food system. You know what I mean? Localizing.
Thank you, Mary. So what you're saying is one of the unconscious, unquestioned assumptions in our system should be that we're all alone.
Yes, and you're not all alone.
We're not alone. We are connected.
Yes.
We build on that.
Look, the whole country where the place is crowded with other than human forms, ancestors, everybody, black and white, or whatever culture. We all have ancestral spirits everywhere, actual ancestors, but ancestors as in animals and birds and so on. So the place is crowded, and just don't imagine that you're on your own on Earth, And I actually think that's. I don't know what you think, Ian. I always think whitefellas imagine somewhere along the way they're alone in the world, and that's why they have to keep building things, and that materialism helps to protect them from this loneliness. And I think it's something to do with spirit and soul, maybe, or something, and why they have to arm themselves, in a lonely sort of place where the environment is the enemy, both the actual physical environment and the social environment. It's all the enemy, and you have to make your way in the world and, say this is mine, and so on. So, I don't know.
Well, that's what you talk about, Mary, with the relationist versus the survivalist way of
thinking. That's right.
Look, I think most people would agree that our economic system has evolved to make people feel they're alone. I mean, you only have to see an ad for insurance. I mean, insurance, but it makes you feel like everything will go wrong and you'll be all alone. It's not that you could ask for help from a neighbor. You must invest in all of these expensive things. But thank you, Mary. And did you want to mention any of the kind of the unconscious ideas in mainstream society we need to challenge to get to this better place?
I was thinking of a Monty Python, like the crazy guys, like, we're all individuals. Well, I'm not, But I think this is one of the things that COVID has taught us. COVID has taught us that we live in a community. And so one of the words we're framing is communityism. And so what COVID has done in our country is that it has connected people who have been isolated. When you live in the city, it's almost like, I don't know who my neighbor is. But what COVID has done is that it's reinvigorated a sense of what community means. And so what we've seen is little stories where a pensioner living on their own has put up in their window, hey, I need someone to drop off my mail. Hey, I need someone to pick up some milk. They were finding situations where little people were getting quite stressed at home, and then they started to put up different teddy bears in the window so families could drive around with their little people and look at the windows and see the new teddy bears. And this is what I think has been something great that has turned out from COVID. It showed that we are part of a community, that we need to have an ethics of care and obligation to each of us as human beings, and that our suburbs are made up of all of us. And so I think that's been a real thing, that no, we're not individuals. We are part of a collective. We are part of community. And when we invigorate that, it shows back to the first forms of capital that I talked about, We need social capital, we need human capital, we need cultural capital, and we need a little bit of economics because we're in the capitalist system. But our lives can be rich and beautiful, and we can reach our full potential when we combine all these forms of capital. So it's not either or, it's how do we see ourselves in a sense of belonging, to a sense of community. And I just want to give a plug, because with the last census, what the last census in our nation showed us, that 60% of Australians have still not met an Aboriginal person, have not got an Aboriginal friend that they would share a book, have to dinner, go to the movies with. 60% of Australians have not met an Aboriginal. And I'm not sure if that's from anxiety, and people know how they are disconnected, but the new census is coming out pretty soon. And I take great hope, because what the census did show us also is that 60% of Australians now are non-Anglo, are non-white. So we are building in our nation a world of pluralism, a pluriverse, where we show multiple cultures and multiple worldviews. So as I said, I have great hope that in the circle of time, we will come to a point where we will seek a just republic on just terms, because the biggest problem is the states, the authority and the control of state government. So regionalism is a dream. It will happen at some point in time. But I want all of you out there who don't have Indigenous friends, who don't have Indigenous colleagues, to change the statistics this time around, to say, yes, I do know Aboriginal people. They do. I will share a book with them. I will read. My world will become much more richer. So these new consensus, I want you to all change the tick the box and tell me that you've reached out and you now, since the last census, started to engage with Indigenous people, because your world will totally be transformed once you get to know Indigenous people. So stop othering us, form a relationship with us. We will shift you from the survivalist mentality to the relationist ethos that Mary is so brave in leading. And we will create a new world together, because this is no longer about government and governance. When you know the story of Australia, you know the corporations came here because they failed, they lost the Americas, they needed to come somewhere else where the resources were. When they came here, except for the Kanak people, they could enslave the people here. So we know multinational companies are in charge of our nation states, not just Australia, but globally. And so if we're going to transition to a new economy, to a new world, it is the mobilization of citizens. Because remember, we are not revolutionaries, we are solutionaries. Thank you.
I love it. We actually have one question left, but because I didn't get to ask Helena about which subconscious stuff we should get rid of, I might get Helena and I to talk to this one. The question was about how do we best educate our young, whether it's about connecting to country or challenging the systems we have. Helena, what do you feel is one of the...
Well, actually, that relates to what I was going to say, that education actually educates us. I think that's an assumption we need to question. So I would definitely be asking people to look for alternatives. There are alternatives emerging, but many of these that include bush schools and that help children get out to actually learn something about life are very expensive. And again, this comes back to looking at the interface between the economy and what we're trying to do, and building up community-based alternatives where those who are a bit better off can subsidize these changes for others. But I would also say, and I want to also answer that question about unconscious assumptions.
Yes.
And my assumption had always been before I went to Ladakh that progress actually did mean that it benefited people, that we were better off living in our houses and all the stuff we had. So I think that's the biggest unconscious assumption, that economic development and progress actually make us happier or even healthier. We're actually now on a track where we're not even getting healthier physically. So we have to go very deep. And it comes right back to the discussion we're having here, because when our baseline is London, after people have been pushed off their land and everything is breaking down and there's illness and there's crime, the official narrative starts there and says, oh, look, economic growth, progress, look how much better off we are. If we start with the Indigenous baseline, We have to turn everything upside down. And what my book is called is Ancient Futures. Those fundamental principles and structures from ancient indigenous cultures that we must take into the future, because they are about life. It's about how to sustain life, our own life and the rest of creation. So it's absolutely essential. And so that the big assumption to rethink is progress.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, look, we might start to wrap up. I guess all I wanted to say in terms of subconscious ideas and how to educate, I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts myself, is that the work we do endlessly shows me that unfortunately, even the most well-intentioned person can often still be deeply human-centered. I've done everything from teaching school kids from the age of 10 to 13 to university students to professionals, and getting folks to think differently. Just getting them to think about the wider Earth community can sometimes be a revelation for them. And I'm not saying that in a condescending way. I just, after 30 years of working on many of these environmental issues, just getting folks to truly be able to imagine that they are connected, that we are interdependent, and that the decisions we make need to be different. That can be a huge step forward. If they can unlock that inside their brain, then we do find folks able to take a different trajectory. So for mine, the main subconscious kind of thing to focus on is ensuring that, that people really have a way to rethink their place in the world. And it's a combination of education, unlearning what we've learned through Western education. It's also having the bravery to not even look to others all the time, but to go outside, sit under a tree, take a deep breath and feel it. If you feel that you are connected, then you're halfway there. Compared to the work that we do for many, many folks in our courses and our workshops and our discussions, that's the very first step. Stop thinking we're alone. And I remember the very first time I read Mary Graham's article, sort of two key elements in Aboriginal life. One was the land is the source of the law, and the other is you're not alone. And I remember just feeling so deeply happy to read those words, to feel in my heart that even though I am from the colonizing forces, I am a descendant of the people who were either dragged here in chains or forced their way here and did awful things. I am a living, breathing earthling on this planet. And by putting my feet in the soil and having a good deep breath and looking at the plants and the animals, I can connect, and everyone can connect. No one can stop us from that. And no one can stop us from taking the next steps in terms of supporting systems that create and, I guess, protect life, rather than the systems we're all very deeply worried about, which are the systems endlessly taking life. So on that note, how good are we? It's just coming up to 2 o'clock. I would like to thank you all for your incredible time. Our speakers, Mary, Anne, Helena, and my good self, have very much enjoyed sharing with you, and I've really enjoyed being part of this discussion. So Mary, Anne, and Helena, if you want to take yourselves off mute and say goodbye, that would be lovely.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle, for pulling this together. And I hope to be in touch with you, Mary and Anne, in the future. And also, I left my email address there. Someone was asking about how to be in touch. So would love to be in touch with this whole community of people who came to this webinar and are interested in these issues. So important that we do get together and that we build up our numbers and our sort of shared concerns.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helena, and good luck with the rest of the localization events. They're absolutely amazing, and I hope everyone can check them out. Anne, did you want to say goodbye?
We don't have a word in our language for goodbye. So we say Galiamabo, which is like see you again soon. I want to give a plug for Gaia University. It's an amazing system that I'm also connected to. They do a lot of work in deconstructing the matrix around organic farming and all of that. But have a look at that. The other thing I want to give a plug for is a new political party, even though I'm not promoting it. I want to say it's called Sustainable Australia Party. Better, not bigger. And I think that's really important. And I've just put a paper in there that I wrote with some colleagues about learning how to feel and hear country. So there's a paper there that I hope you guys will capture before you all take off. But thank you once again for your time. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for the collective wisdom from the other women who've spoken. And there is a very big, important anthology of feminist poems coming out where many Indigenous women have written with the content of matrix. And what we said is that first law is not about deconstructing the matrix. It's the fusion of the matrix with the patrix. So yeah, watch this space. Thank you all. Thank you for your love and attention and ethics of care. Thank you to Mary, who's just a champion. And Helena, I would really love to get to know you more, because some of the things that we're doing globally really connect with the words that you're saying. Thank you, Michelle, for being on and driving this. And yeah, lots of love. Take care. And we are going to transform the world. We have to. We've only got 10 years to do it, and we can do it together. Thank you. We must.
Thank you, Anne. And Mary, did you want to say goodbye?
Yes, just to say goodbye. And it's been a wonderful, webinar. And I've always loved talking to Anne and yourself, of course, and very glad to meet you. Helena, I would love to keep up, talking to you, because my own area of interest is political science and new systems. The world is crying out for whole new systems, but it's going to be really hard, I think. But anyway, let's get talking.
Please,
and women.
I put my email. Michelle, you can put us in touch.
Oh, absolutely. I'll
that would
connect
be
you all
wonderful.
again.
That's
Not a
wonderful.
worry.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have an awesome day. We'll see you soon
Bye.
on a Zoom call near you. Bye.